I guess the first thing we're going to talk about, Matt, can you tell us a little bit about, I guess what we are often talking about, Windows vulnerabilities. We've been talking about the exploits against, or potential exploits against mobile devices, but Mac's also in the mix here.
Yeah, Macs don't get as much of the attention as they probably should, I think. They're a much more popular brand in the last decade or so, and I think a lot more attention is being paid to them in the last few years, but not quite pierced into the consciousness yet. A really good talk coming out of 31C3, the Chaos Communication Congress this year. Trammell Hudson did some work using the Thunderbolt connector, which is a high-speed bus on several Apple products, to actually install malicious firmware. And I'm not talking about, malicious software, or this is at the firmware level. This is before the operating system even boots. Now, this is some serious work. They're calling it Thunderstrike, and it takes advantage of a number of interesting flaws that Trammell was able to find in the platform. The most interesting to me is that there's a function called option ROMs, which is from back in the old Intel 8088 days, where you could plug in a physical chip into the motherboard, and that would add on extra functionality like support for BASIC or some other code. Apparently, this is still part of the spec, and Thunderbolt allows you to directly access certain functions during boot. And I'm not doing it justice because it's nuanced and it's delicate and it's interesting. But basically, you can devise a device using Thunderbolt that you plug in. It interrupts a firmware update in the recovery mode, rewrites an RSA key with a pre-chosen one you've determined, and then you push it firmware that you've signed with that key. So now you not only change the boot protection key that verifies the firmware, you're rewriting the whole firmware and you control it from the ground up.
And it's authorized.
And it's authorized. And no one else can update any more firmware because you've changed that key. So, I mean, there's a really...
best you've bricked the device, right?
Well,
Ransomware of sorts?
It requires physical access, and that's the difference. Most ransomware we see is over the internet installation. Right. And there's no way to do this from software that's been developed yet. It requires that physical access. That's the key point. But, I mean, as people have been discussing for years, if you have an evil maid attack where someone leaves their laptop in the hotel room and takes a few seconds for this to happen, or maybe it's out of your sight for 5 seconds at an airport checkpoint or something like that, it's very possible for this to happen, and it's very difficult or nigh impossible to detect. And the only way to protect yourself against it is to actually perform the attack on yourself and change the key.
Wow.
Which is, it's crazy.
Interesting.
I was going to say, or super glue the Thunderbolt port.
Yeah.
Well, that's not, there's actually some interesting discussion of physical defenses against it. Filling in your ports using. It was interesting. Someone developed or came up with the idea of using like flecked nail polish with a certain pattern. So you for security, if you want to prevent tampering with screws or other things, you use this pattern nail polish and you photograph the pattern because it's relatively random. If someone were to decide to paint over it again with that same nail polish, no two patterns would be the same. So, I mean, there's a whole great discussion of this physical security defenses against it too, but this was some excellent work.
Yeah.
Wow.
Very cool. So this is research work, correct? This is not something that's in the wild, but it's something we need to be considering. And I can't help but date myself here a little bit, but I remember when it used to be you actually had to flip a switch to be able to actually change the BIOS or actually change the chip.
Switches
and I think that's perhaps where we really need to go to. That is, how often do you really need to flash the BIOS, really update the BIOS? If you're going to do it, it should be something that is well controlled, hard to do. I mean, not hard. Perhaps is not the word we're looking for, but
control.
A high barrier of control.
Yes, the barrier.
And,
that's
So and I can't help it. You mentioned the nail polish thing. It reminds me of one of the James Bond movies where he takes a hair and he puts it across the
exactly right. That's what I was thinking. Or a piece of paper or a toothpick.
Right. So good story, Matt. Thank you for bringing that.